This is what he said to the actor. I said, oh. So now we got in this big argument for 20 minutes. I called him every night. He was saying he didn't know it, and I got lightheaded.
Once celebrated as one of Hollywood's most respected actors, Robert Duvall now finds himself in a chapter no one could have imagined. Behind the fame was a life shaped by love stories that burned bright, then quietly faded. 4 marriages, no children, and a lifetime spent chasing something just out of reach. For decades, he lived with an intensity that defined both his art and his spirit, dancing, laughing, and loving with unmatched passion. But now at 94, that fire has dimmed. The man who once breathed life into unforgettable characters is facing his most personal role yet, his battle against time itself. The unknown chapter of Robert Duvall. In the entertainment industry, the word legend often gets thrown around too easily. But when it comes to Robert Duvall, that title couldn't be more fitting. He's one of those rare actors who's done it all, won every major award, delivered unforgettable performances, and left behind a body of work that still gets studied and celebrated today. One of his most iconic moments came in the 1979 masterpiece Apocalypse Now. Playing Lieutenant Colonel Bill Kilgore, Duvall delivered one of cinema's most quoted lines, "I love the smell of napalm in the morning." Directed by Francis Ford Coppola, the film is a haunting exploration of war and human nature, one that still sparks discussion decades later. But for Duvall, that connection to the story ran deeper than just a role. He wasn't just portraying a soldier, he came from a military family. His father, Navy Rear Admiral William Howard Duvall, had enlisted in the Naval Academy at 16 and served well into his children's lives. Naturally, he hoped Robert would follow in his footsteps. And in a way, he did, just not for long. In 1953, Robert Duvall joined the U.S. Army, serving 2 years and rising to the rank of Private First Class before receiving an honorable discharge. It was during his time stationed at Camp Gordon in Georgia that fate quietly intervened. He took part in an amateur stage production of the Comedy Room Service in nearby Augusta. That small local play would become the spark that ignited one of Hollywood's greatest careers. Like many struggling actors, Duvall's early years were all about survival. In 1950s New York City, where rent was brutal even back then, he shared a cramped 3-bedroom apartment with several others. Among them, a young Dustin Hoffman. Duvall later laughed about those days, recalling how Hoffman, or Dusty as he called him, was always surrounded by women while he himself wasn't quite as lucky. Their little circle of aspiring artists didn't end there. Another future icon, Gene Hackman, had actually helped set up the apartment arrangement. When Hoffman first arrived in New York with just $50 to his name, he even slept on Hackman and his wife's floor before eventually moving in with Duvall. The three of them, Duvall, Hoffman, and Hackman, became close friends and classmates at the prestigious neighborhood Playhouse School of the Theater, paying for their studies through the GI Bill. To make ends meet, Duvall took on odd jobs, sorting mail, driving trucks, even clerking at Macy's, while dedicating every spare moment to perfecting his craft on stage. Throughout the 1950s, he built his reputation in theater, appearing in productions like Dial M for Murder, The Crucible, and Picnic. But his defining stage role came in 1957 at Long Island's Gateway Playhouse, where he portrayed Eddie Carbone in Arthur Miller's A View from the Bridge. Duvall would later credit that role as the turning point of his entire career. By 1961, he was still grinding, mostly performing off-Broadway and taking small television roles. But behind the scenes, destiny was working in his favor. A playwright he'd known since his student days, Horton Foote, was adapting a best-selling novel for a low-budget film project. When director Robert Mulligan and producer Alan J. Pakula began casting, Foote recommended Duvall for a small but crucial part. The film turned out to be To Kill a Mockingbird, released in 1962. The movie went on to win Academy Awards and earn a place among the most inspirational films in American history. Duvall's role as Boo Radley was brief and wordless, but it left an unforgettable impact. In the film's closing scene, Boo emerges from the shadows to save young Scout Finch. When she finally sees him for the first time, his shy smile says more than dialogue ever could. In less than 2 minutes of screen time, Duvall captured the audience's heart with nothing but quiet expression and presence. That performance, his film debut at 31, proved something extraordinary. Even without a single line, Robert Duvall had arrived. It was the start of a career that would define generations, setting the foundation for one of the greatest actors to ever step in front of a camera. Robert Duvall's hidden masterpiece you've never seen. In 1963, Robert Duvall appeared in one of the most overlooked yet fascinating episodes of Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone. The episode, titled Miniature from Season 4, Episode 8, tells the story of Charlie Parks, a lonely man whose quiet life takes a surreal turn. Charlie spends most of his time wandering the local museum. Sure, the cheap lunches are a plus, but more than anything, he finds comfort among the exhibits. They're steady, predictable, and somehow easier to be around than people. Then one day, as he's exploring the museum's miniature exhibit, he notices something completely unreal, a small female doll inside a dollhouse that comes to life before his eyes. Charlie becomes obsessed. To him, she isn't just a doll, she's real. He falls deeply in love with her, convinced she's alive. But no one believes him, not his family, not the museum staff, not even the security guard. His growing fixation lands him in a psychiatric hospital where everyone assumes he's lost touch with reality. Eventually, Charlie pretends to recover, managing to convince doctors and family that he's fine. Once released, he quietly disappears. His family, fearing the worst, rushes to the museum, but he's nowhere to be found. Then comes the twist. The same guard who once dismissed Charlie's story peers into the dollhouse again and finally sees it. The female doll is alive, smiling beside a tiny, laughing Charlie. The guard's shock turns into a soft, knowing smile, as if realizing that in his own strange way, Charlie finally found peace. Miniature might not appear on every Best of the Twilight Zone list, but it's one of the show's most touching and quietly profound stories. It trades big sci-fi spectacle for something more human, a gentle, almost heartbreaking look at loneliness and the need to belong. Despite its fantasy premise, it feels surprisingly grounded. Charlie isn't portrayed as crazy or dangerous, just different, a man who doesn't quite fit into the world but still longs for connection. There's a subtle wisdom in how the episode handles mental health. It doesn't sensationalize Charlie's struggles or make him a joke. Instead, it paints loneliness as something that can exist even when people care about you. And in the end, his escape into that tiny world isn't tragic, it's almost uplifting. For once, someone who never truly fit in finds a place where he belongs, and even someone else, the guard, acknowledges that joy. Still, Miniature almost disappeared from history. After its release, a writer claimed the episode was a ripoff of their script, The 13th Mannequin, which had been submitted to Cayuga, the company behind The Twilight Zone. That script also featured a man who falls in love with a mannequin that comes to life. The similarities sparked a lawsuit, though the case was eventually thrown out when the judge ruled there wasn't enough overlap to prove copyright infringement. But the timing couldn't have been worse. The legal dispute unfolded just as The Twilight Zone was being prepared for syndication. Because of the lawsuit, Miniature was excluded from reruns. That meant unless viewers caught the original broadcast back in 1963, they never got the chance to see it again. The lost film that made Duvall a star. Now, long before Robert became a household name, he was a dedicated stage actor, putting in years of work on and off Broadway. Every time he stepped onto that stage, audiences knew they were in for something special. But eventually, Duvall made the leap to film and television. In those early years, he was the guy you'd spot in the background or see pop up in small TV roles, often without much recognition. You might catch him in movies like The Chase with Marlon Brando or Smaller Latte. 60s projects like Countdown and The Rain People, where he shared the screen with James Caan. That last one, The Rain People, wasn't just another job for Duvall. It marked the beginning of a creative partnership with a young filmmaker who was about to change cinema forever, Francis Ford Coppola. Before 1969, if you looked at Coppola's resume, you'd never guess he was on the verge of making The Godfather, a movie that would redefine American film. But The Rain People was a turning point. It showed Coppola stripping away the excess and focusing on what truly mattered: character and emotion. The film tells the story of Natalie, played by Shirley Knight, a woman who discovers she's pregnant and decides to run away from her predictable suburban life. Along the road, she meets two men: Killer, a brain-damaged ex-football player played by James Caan, and Gordon, a menacing highway patrol officer portrayed by Duvall. What unfolds is a quiet, deeply human story about freedom, regret, and identity. When The Rain People came out, it fit perfectly into the emerging New Hollywood movement, a time when young filmmakers were rebelling against the glossy, formulaic studio system. This new generation wanted raw stories that reflected the turbulence of the real world. Coppola was right there at the forefront, crafting something meditative and emotional rather than loud or predictable. Watching The Rain People today feels like seeing Coppola's raw talent take shape for the first time. Sure, he'd later make massive operatic films like Apocalypse Now and Bram Stoker's Dracula, but his real strength was always in intimate storytelling, films where the emotion lived between the lines. The movie's loose, wandering pace mirrors Natalie's own confusion, and that sense of aimlessness becomes the entire point. It's not a film about plot, it's about feeling. Behind the camera, Coppola was still finding his voice, experimenting with tone and structure. Interestingly, his friend George Lucas was there, capturing it all in a behind-the-scenes documentary called Filmmaker. It's a rare glimpse at a young director wrestling with his art before fame found him. What's fascinating is how The Rain People connects to other films of that era, like Martin Scorsese's Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. Both movies explore women stepping away from conformity and searching for meaning. And even though Coppola and Scorsese would later become known for hard-edged, masculine stories about crime and power, these earlier works showed how deeply they could empathize with different perspectives. Coppola's personal life is also woven into The Rain People. As a child, he battled polio, leaving him isolated from the world. That sense of confinement and the desire to break free echoes in Natalie's journey. For Coppola, filmmaking became the ultimate escape, his way of reclaiming a life that illness had once limited. He even spent time at a military school before dropping out, so he knew what it meant to walk away from rigid rules and expectations. Of course, the film isn't perfect. At times, it drifts or loses its pulse, but that restlessness becomes part of its DNA. It's caught between two worlds: the traditional American storytelling of Steinbeck and Ford and the experimental spirit of New Hollywood. The ending, with its violent confrontation between Duvall's character and Natalie, lands like a gut punch. It refuses to offer neat resolutions, a choice Coppola would later master in The Godfather, where he revealed the American dream as something far darker than it appeared. That same year, 1969, Duvall was also making waves in another corner of Hollywood. He took on the role of Lucky Ned Pepper in the Western classic True Grit, going toe-to-toe with John Wayne's Rooster Cogburn in one of cinema's most famous showdowns. But behind the scenes, True Grit wasn't all smooth riding. John Wayne had fought hard for that role, determined to bring Charles Portis's novel to life. It would eventually win him his first and only Oscar, but not without some tension along the way. At one point, Elvis Presley was even offered a supporting role, but his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, demanded top billing, something the studio refused. The part went instead to singer Glenn Campbell, joining a cast that also included Dennis Hopper, who was simultaneously releasing his counterculture hit Easy Rider. Then there was Duvall, gritty, intense, and from a completely different acting world than Wayne. Wayne represented old Hollywood: professionalism, control, and moral clarity. Duvall came from the method school, where emotion ruled and authenticity was everything. That mix was volatile. Both men had short tempers, and their personalities clashed repeatedly on set. Most of the tension came from Duvall's constant battles with director Henry Hathaway, a veteran filmmaker known for his rigid, no-nonsense style. Hathaway's way of directing grated on Duvall. He once said he'd say, "When I say action, tense up, goddamn you." It's hard to work under that as a young actor. Their arguments were so frequent that Wayne eventually stepped in, threatening to punch Duvall if he didn't calm down and follow the director's lead. Whether that threat worked or not, no one knows. But what's certain is that True Grit turned out to be a defining film for both men, a blend of old-school Western heroism and new-school intensity. And for Robert Duvall, it was one more step on the road to becoming one of America's greatest character actors. The movie that nearly broke Robert Duvall. One of Robert Duvall's earliest standout performances came in the 1970 film MASH, where he played Major Frank Burns. With a career as long and storied as his, Duvall has an endless list of roles to reflect on. But like many great actors, some of his most cherished projects are the ones that flew under the radar. In an interview with Movieline, Duvall revealed that one of those hidden gems was a little-known 1972 film titled Tomorrow. The story behind it traces back to his friend, screenwriter Horton Foote, who secured the rights to adapt a William Faulkner short story for the big screen. Joseph Anthony directed Duvall and a small cast in the film, but despite the collaboration with his close friend, Duvall was far from satisfied with the final cut. He explained that a crucial emotional scene, where his character sees his son as a grown man, was removed without his knowledge. That single decision frustrated him so deeply that he refused to watch the movie for a year. It wasn't just professional disappointment, it felt personal. Foote, after all, was a trusted friend, and Duvall admitted that the experience left him feeling betrayed. Horton Foote, of course, wasn't just any screenwriter. He was the same man who adapted To Kill a Mockingbird for the screen, a move that helped launch Duvall's film career in the first place. Foote's writing credits also included Baby the Rain Must Fall with Steve McQueen and Gary Sinase's Of Mice and Men. But the fallout from Tomorrow clearly left a mark. Duvall even expressed frustration at how much creative control younger actors were starting to take in editing rooms at the time, saying he wished he'd known better back then. The movie itself told the story of Jackson Fentry, a lonely Mississippi farmer living in isolation until a pregnant woman named Sarah, played by Olga Bellin, arrives seeking refuge. Their quiet, tender connection drives the heart of the film. Despite its emotional core, Tomorrow went largely unnoticed when it was released. Still, the film found a second life years later thanks to French actor Gérard Depardieu, who loved it so much that he bought the rights and distributed it in France. That small gesture gave the film a new audience and a touch of the appreciation Duvall always felt it deserved. Even though Tomorrow caused him some personal disappointment, Duvall's career didn't slow down one bit. The very same year, 1972, saw the release of The Godfather, the movie that would forever cement his place in cinematic history. Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather became more than a film. It was a cultural moment. With a powerhouse cast that included Marlon Brando, Al Pacino, Diane Keaton, and Duvall himself, it swept up 11 Oscar nominations and took home 3 Academy Awards. Duvall, who played Tom Hagen, the Corleone family's consigliere and adopted son, brought calm intelligence and emotional depth to the role. When asked later if he had any idea how monumental the film would become, Duvall admitted he did. He recalled that only twice in his entire career had he sensed that a project was destined to be special, and The Godfather was one of those times. About a third of the way through filming, he said he could just feel it. They were creating something that would live on for generations. Of course, not everything on set was serious business. Despite the film's intensity, there was plenty of lighthearted mischief behind the scenes. One of the funniest stories involved Duvall, James Caan, and Marlon Brando engaging in a full-blown mooning contest during breaks in filming. It started as a dare and quickly became a running gag throughout production, with Brando eventually crowned the champion. When Duvall was later asked about it, he laughed it off and said he couldn't share all the stories, mainly because his wife would kill him if he did. That playful energy might have helped balance the heavy atmosphere of the movie's subject matter. And when the dust finally settled, Duvall's early instinct proved to be absolutely right. The Godfather didn't just succeed, it exploded, earning over $270 million on a $7 million budget and becoming one of the most influential films ever made. Duvall himself earned a nomination for Best Supporting Actor, a clear nod to the quiet power he brought to the screen. Looking back, It's almost funny how obvious The Godfather's greatness seems now. But in 1972, predicting that kind of cultural legacy took real vision. Duvall's belief in the project wasn't arrogance. It was intuition born from years of craft and an understanding of when a cast, script, and director align perfectly. More than 50 years later, as The Godfather continues to shape modern cinema, Duvall's early confidence feels prophetic. He truly called it before the world caught on. After the explosive success of The Godfather in 1972, Robert Duvall's career was on fire. His performance had opened every door in Hollywood, and offers began flooding in. One of the most intriguing came from a young, ambitious director named Steven Spielberg, who was putting together a film that would soon change cinema forever, Jaws in 1975. That movie went on to become the highest-grossing film of its time and set the standard for what we now call the modern summer blockbuster. But here's where things get interesting. Duvall actually turned it down. It wasn't about the money or the script. He simply wanted a different role than the one Spielberg had in mind. Spielberg wanted him for the lead role of Chief Martin Brody, which eventually went to Roy Scheider. Duvall, however, had his eye on a different character entirely, the grizzled shark hunter, Quint. He even sat down with Spielberg for a couple of hours to discuss it. Since the story was set in an area with a strong Portuguese influence, Duvall thought it'd be fascinating to bring that background to the role. But Spielberg felt he was too young for the part. In the end, Robert Shaw's portrayal of Quint became legendary, and Duvall had nothing but praise for both Shaw and the film itself. It was just one of those moments where timing made all the difference. A few years later, Duvall's path led him to another cinematic milestone, Apocalypse Now, in 1979. His role as Lieutenant Colonel Bill Kilgore didn't just earn him his second Oscar nomination. It also landed him a spot in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most versatile actor in the world. It's funny, though. Despite his long history with director Francis Ford Coppola, Duvall wasn't Coppola's first choice for the role. The two had already worked together on The Rain People, The Conversation, The Godfather Part II, and even on George Lucas's THX 1138, which Coppola produced. Still, when casting Apocalypse Now, Coppola initially wanted Gene Hackman for the role of Kilgore. Even after Hackman dropped out, Duvall wasn't sold right away. He hesitated until some key script changes were made. In early drafts, the character was named Wyatt Kanaj, an on-the-nose play on the word carnage. Duvall pushed to tone things down, aiming for a portrayal that felt more grounded and less cartoonish. Of course, that decision paid off. Kilgore became one of the most unforgettable figures in movie history. And with that came one of the most famous lines ever spoken on film. "I love the smell of napalm in the morning." It's a line that's still quoted, remixed, and parodied more than 4 decades later. A pop culture echo that refuses to fade. When asked years later if he ever imagined the role would become so iconic, Duvall's answer was simple: he had no idea. He admitted that John Milius's original script was a bit over the top, even naming the character Colonel Carnage and dressing him in cowboy boots and a hat. Duvall thought it was ridiculous and pushed for a more believable take. He later joked that the fame of that one line had become something of a curse. He still gets approached by people who repeat it back to him as if they're the first ones to think of it, a reminder of how deeply that single moment has embedded itself in pop culture. After Apocalypse Now, Duvall's versatility only became clearer. He shifted easily between leading and supporting roles, earning more Oscar nominations for The Great Santini in 1979 and Tender Mercies in 1983. In Tender Mercies, he surprised audiences by showing off his singing ability, something he took so seriously that he insisted on doing his own vocals and had it written into his contract. The role Robert Duvall refused to play. When The Godfather Part III finally arrived in theaters in 1990, 16 years after its legendary predecessor, one major face was noticeably absent: Robert Duvall. The script brushed past his disappearance, mentioning only that Tom Hagen had died sometime before his son, Father Andrew Hagen, was ordained as a priest. No cause of death, no backstory, just gone. But behind the scenes, Duvall's absence wasn't a creative choice. It came down to something much simpler: money. The return of the Godfather franchise was fueled by the same thing that had made it famous in the first place: massive box office success. Paramount knew a third installment meant more profit, and they weren't shy about it. So when it came time to bring the cast back together, Al Pacino was offered a whopping $5 million to step once again into the role of Michael Corleone. Duvall, on the other hand, was offered just $1 million. Now, considering that the movie's entire existence was driven by profit, Duvall's response made perfect sense. He didn't ask to be paid more than Pacino, just fairly. He felt his contribution to the saga warranted at least half of what Pacino was getting. But when director Francis Ford Coppola and the studio refused to budge, Duvall walked. Later, he explained the decision bluntly. He said he didn't mind if Pacino made double what he did, but 3 or 4 times more? That was unacceptable. To him, the pay gap wasn't just about money, it was about respect. He believed everyone involved was there for the paycheck anyway, pointing out that if they truly cared about the story, they wouldn't have waited 15 years to make another sequel. For Duvall, the breaking point came when he realized the studio was offering Pacino nearly 5 times his salary. That, he said, was simply beyond reason. Ironically, Pacino himself later agreed that money was the engine behind The Godfather Part III. Coppola, too, had his reasons. After The Godfather Part II, he wanted nothing more to do with the Corleone family. He was finished with sequels and ready to move on. But then came One from the Heart, a costly passion project that bombed spectacularly and pushed him to the edge of financial ruin. Faced with debts and dwindling opportunities, Coppola accepted Paramount's offer to return to the saga he'd once sworn off. He admitted later that he took the job out of necessity, not passion, saying he needed the money after almost losing everything. It was a tough position for a filmmaker once at the height of his creative powers. Trying to follow 2 cinematic masterpieces was never going to be easy, and The Godfather Part III faced enormous expectations. When it finally premiered, the reaction was far less enthusiastic than anyone hoped. Duvall later said he didn't regret missing it, claiming it simply wasn't on the same level as the originals. He even recalled a humorous moment with Coppola that showed where the director's priorities really were. Coppola had visited Duvall at his Virginia home, asking for his mother's famous Maryland crab cake recipe. They talked briefly about Godfather III, but when Coppola left, he forgot the recipe and called Duvall later, more worried about that than whether he'd join the movie. By that point, Coppola's once unstoppable streak, The Conversation, Apocalypse Now, and others, had hit serious turbulence. His independent studio, Zoetrope, was collapsing under the weight of financial losses, forcing him to sell it just to stay afloat. Films like The Outsiders and New York Stories failed to bring in much at the box office, and critics began questioning his judgment. Meanwhile, Al Pacino himself was growing tired of playing Michael Corleone. Coppola didn't even want to make a third film, believing the first 2 were perfect as they were. But money talks, and so The Godfather Part III was born. The result was a mixed bag. Critics were divided, audiences were lukewarm, and it never reached the heights of its predecessors. Still, for all its flaws, the weaker subplots, the absence of Tom Hagen, and the impossible shadow of the first 2 films, it managed to give Michael Corleone a haunting Shakespearean conclusion that closed one of cinema's greatest sagas with quiet tragedy. Robert Duvall is 94. How he lives now is heartbreaking. When it comes to Robert Duvall's life off-screen, one thing that stands out is his long and eventful history with marriage. He's been married 4 times. What's even more interesting is that he never had children. Duvall himself has joked about it, once saying he must be shooting blanks, and even mentioned that he tried to have kids with a lot of different women in and out of marriage. His first marriage dates back to 1964 when he wed Barbara Benjamin. They met while he was filming To Kill a Mockingbird. Barbara, a former announcer and dancer on the Jackie Gleason Show, also had some acting experience under the name Barbara Brent, appearing in films like Guys and Dolls and The Courtship of Eddie's Father. She already had 2 daughters from a previous marriage, and their relationship lasted until 1975. Years later, Duvall married actress Gail Youngs in 1982. Their marriage lasted 4 years, ending in 1986. During that time, he became part of a Hollywood family. Gail's siblings included actors John Savage, Robin Young, and Jim Youngs. In 1991, Duvall tied the knot again, this time with Sharon Brophy, a professional dancer. That marriage lasted until 1995. Then came his fourth and current wife, Luciana Pedraza, whom he married in 2005. Luciana has quite a background herself. She's the granddaughter of Argentine aviation pioneer Susanna Ferrari Billinghurst. The way they met almost sounds scripted for a romantic film. Duvall was in Argentina and stopped by a bakery after finding the flower shop he planned to visit was closed. That simple twist of fate led him to Luciana. They share the same birthday, January 5th, though there's a 41-year age gap between them. They had actually been together since 1997, long before officially getting married. Their relationship even extended to the screen when Duvall cast her in Assassination Tango, a film he produced, directed, and starred in, shot mostly in Buenos Aires. The project reflected one of his personal passions, Argentine tango.